Good afternoon, and apologies for the delay. There are some technical problems on my side. The materials that we're covering today, the two sessions that we're covering today, have a lot of content that I'm going to be going through fairly quickly. Um, and part of the purpose of piloting this is to gauge um, whether the content is appropriate, the time is appropriate, the level of detail is appropriate. So I definitely look forward to your feedback. So we're covering now agricultural decision making in a variable climate. In general, the more we understand the decisions that farmers and other agricultural stakeholders will make based on climate information, the better able we will be to support them with effective and relevant climate services. Objectives. After the session, you should be able to explain how differences in household goals and resource constraints uh, can lead farmers to select different management options, even with the same weather or climate information. Identify timescales of important agricultural management decisions and the climate information that would best support those decisions. Describe how climate risk and risk aversion influence farmers' choice among management options, and discuss how simulation modeling and enterprise budgets can provide information and insights about farmers' climate sensitive management decisions. So we'll talk first about decision making, um, climate sensitive agricultural decisions, and what factors interact with climate information, uh, time scales, risk aversion, and then a very brief and somewhat superficial introduction to a few tools that can be used to guide climate sensitive agricultural decisions. So if we're going to have a session about climate sensitive agricultural decisions, we need a definition. So uh, a management decision is climate sensitive if either different observed or different expected weather or climate conditions would lead a decision maker to select a different option. This is not the same as climate sensitivity in a lot of climate work, which talks about a lot of climate science and climate change work, which is focused on how much does the climate system change in response to changes in human activities. This is about uh, whether or not climate affects a particular decision. However, even in the case where climate is important for a decision, there are many other factors that influence a farmer's choice. So farmers have differing goals. Individual farmers, even in the same location under the same climate conditions, may have differing goals. Some examples of farmer goals would be uh, sustenance, income, accumulating uh, productive assets such as land or livestock, avoiding drudgery, unpleasant work, social status, providing better livelihoods, lives for their children, for example, through education. Let me adjust the window here so I can see more clearly. Importantly, farmers also face different resource constraints, differing availability of land for cultivation, household labor, capital, savings, credit, equipment. Also, social capital, their ability to access uh, social and institutional services. And also, farmers have differing attitudes towards risk and differing ability to manage risk. Most farmers are risk averse, which means that this means that they would prefer they'd be willing to reduce some of their average income to reduce the riskiness of their income or their livelihoods. And we'll talk more about risk aversion shortly. So as a result of these factors, there's no one management decision that's right for all farmers based on, for example, a forecast. Farmers may, even within a community, within a farming system, maybe respond very differently to weather and climate information. Time is important for agriculture, and time is important for understanding climate and climate services. There are two important aspects of time that I'd like to highlight that have implications for climate services. First is seasonality. This refers to the times of year when agricultural activities occur, when key management decisions are made. Agriculture tends to follow an annual cycle, and that cycle is closely linked to the climate. I'm suspecting that many of you have encountered agricultural calendars or crop calendars of some form in the past. An agricultural calendar can be superimposed with graphs of climate seasonal cycles, and that can provide some insights about what's happening with the climate system when particular agricultural activities happen. So this is an example from a publication from southern Zambia that presents an agricultural calendar for several different agricultural commodities and systems. And on top of it, I added some graphs that are available from the National Meteorological Service of, showing the seasonal cycle, average seasonal cycle of rainfall and minimum and maximum temperature. And so this kind of makes it obvious why there are particular times of year when the farmers plant and when they tend to harvest. Another aspect of time is decision time horizon. Every decision has its own time horizon. That refers to how far into the future a decision maker considers when evaluating the consequences of a decision option. The diagram on the bottom kind of illustrates that there's a point in time when a decision is made, a point in time when consequences of that decision are experienced. But in many cases in agriculture, there's a gap, a period when uncertain conditions can also affect the outcome. And this is one of the fundamental challenges for climate-sensitive agricultural decision-making, that period of time when climate conditions may impact the consequences between when the farmer has to make decisions and when those experiences are realized. So if you know something about the seasonality and the time horizon of farmers' decisions or the decisions of other agricultural decision makers, give some insights about climate information that may be useful. For climate information to be useful, number one, that information must be available when the decision has to be made. And number two, the time scale of the information should match the time horizon of the decision. So let's think of an obvious example. A groundnut farmer in Senegal needs to decide what variety to plant. So that farmer has to make that decision before she can buy seeds. If the farmer may plant, for example, sometime between the beginning of June and the middle of July, depending on when rains start, then the seasonality of that decision is kind of at the beginning of that planting window. But that farmer may need a few extra days, a few extra weeks to secure credit, to locate the seeds. and purchase them. So that extends the time horizon. So climate information would need to be available possibly a few weeks before the earliest possible planting date. The farmer will not know whether she has made a good choice until harvest, which may occur 3.5 months later. So that the decision time horizon is about 3.5, maybe 4 months. So an example of climate information that could help that decision is a seasonal climate forecast, if it is available by about the middle of May. So now I'll introduce another concept. And again, I suspect most of you have heard the term of risk aversion. Risk aversion simply means that a decision maker does not like risk, does not like the uncertainty that he or she may face when they're making decisions, uncertainty about the impacts of those decisions because the impacts interact with climate or other sources of variability in the environment. But risk aversion can be thought of as a balancing act between the goal of increasing expected return or long-term average return and decreasing the riskiness or the variability of return. So a risk-averse decision maker would be willing to sacrifice some expected return in order to reduce the riskiness of return. A useful way to visualize this is what we call an ES graph. E for expected return, S for standard deviation. The mean return, expected return is on the vertical axis, standard deviation on the horizontal axis, and the 5 letters represent the long-term mean and standard deviation of net returns for some agricultural decision that has 5 different options that the farmer may consider. This is hypothetical, it's not a specific decision, but just think of any farmer decision that is sensitive to climate conditions. So we can make 2 assumptions about most farmers, most decisions. They prefer to have higher expected income, higher expected return. So they want to go up on the vertical axis, but they also prefer lower variability, which means that they want to go to the left on the standard deviation axis. Lower standard deviation means lower variability, lower risk. Now, the relative importance of these is a function of risk aversion. The higher the level of risk aversion, the more important it is to reduce variability. If an individual seeks to maximize expected return without considering risk, that person would be described as risk neutral. So in this case, what option would a risk neutral farmer choose? A risk neutral farmer would just simply select the option that has the highest expected income, which is option D. A farmer who is slightly risk averse might prefer option C instead of option D because option C reduces the standard deviation of returns, meaning the option C has a significantly lower risk with a slightly lower mean return. A farmer who is a little more risk averse might instead choose option B because it would allow a further moderate reduction of risk at the expense of a moderate reduction of mean return. And a farmer who is extremely risk averse might choose option A, which has the lowest standard deviation, but also lowest expected return. Would any farmer choose option E? Why or why not? If we were doing this training in person, then we'd we'd pause for discussion on some of these points. Well, my answer is no. No farmer who follows these simple assumptions would select option E. And the reason why is that either option B or option C would provide both higher expected return and lower variability of return. So no matter what the level of risk aversion, option B and option C are superior options over option E. I'm going to briefly talk about tools and sources of data that might be used if we're trying to evaluate decision alternatives. So the ES graph that I showed you can be a simple way of visualizing the trade-off between risk and returns. It's also an analytical tool that can identify options that some decision makers might select, but also other options that no decision maker would accept or would consider. So it's a useful tool in decision analysis. But then it begs the question, how do we get means and standard deviations for different management options? Making decisions under uncertainty always requires estimating some aspect of the probability distribution, mean returns, their variability, for the consequences, economic or productivity consequences for each option that the decision maker is considering. Now, often, perhaps most often, this is based on subjective personal experience, intuition. But that is, you know, personal experience, personal intuition is sometimes prone to errors. It can also be done from objective information and objective analyses. And as agricultural professionals, or for some of you, future agricultural professionals, it's useful to know where you might be able to get objective information and what the objective analyses uh, might provide. But it's also important to realize that the analytical tools and sources of information all have important limitations. So some of the places where you may get data about uh, mean and variability of returns or productivity, historical agricultural production statistics. Two limitations. Those statistics are collected over a very large area and might not be very relevant to an individual farmer. They also don't show you how production statistics are affected by management, possible changes in management. But one benefit is that they're often available for many years, so they can be a way of looking at how climate variability impacts production variability, or variability even in areas planted, total production. Farm records. This could be a very relevant source of information to answer questions for a particular farm if a farmer keeps records over many years. But again, like with agricultural production statistics, the farmer won't necessarily test different management strategies. Variety trials, agronomic trials, they can provide useful information, but often they're not repeated over many years, or in the case of variety trials, they're not replicated with different management other than different varieties. So all of these have some potential value. Crop simulation models, in the case of agronomic decisions, can be a very powerful tool to convert information about climate and management into estimates of productivity. And then they can be combined also with enterprise budgets to convert estimates of productivity into profitability. So I'm going to briefly introduce crop simulation models and enterprise budgets with the objective of developing some awareness of what they can do, their capabilities and limitations. Developing skills to actually use these tools effectively is absolutely beyond the scope of this module. And you also will not be tested on calculations or other details, but some general principles um, are a part of our objective. Crop simulation models are computer programs that are programmed to mimic the growth and development processes of a crop. When crop simulation models were first developed, starting, I think, in the late 1970s and 1980s, the goal was to integrate different aspects of knowledge about crop physiology, phenology, which means the development, ecology, how the crop interacts with its environment. And a term that was used a lot in the early crop modeling work was understanding G by E by M interactions. So how do crop genetic characteristics, environment, and management interact to affect productivity? As that work matured, as crop models advanced in their capability of capturing these interactions, that capacity opened up a lot of interest and opportunities to use them for decision support, for transferring technologies that have been developed or tested in one location to new environments that may have different climate and soils. And the applications of crop simulation models have proliferated and right now are very, very broad. A typical crop simulation model might simulate particularly management decisions, soil, water, soil nitrogen balance, phenology, which is the rate of in which it passes through development stages, photosynthesis, which creates biomass, respiration, which is one mechanism by which it loses biomass, partitioning between different plant parts, which is important to know what will be the yield of grain or tuber or other storage organs that are sold or consumed. And then later in the growing season, senescence, death of the crop. So typically, after a crop model reads initial inputs, it will go through in a given day all of these calculations, then ask, has the crop reached maturity? If not, it will read any new, output any daily outputs, read any new weather data or other inputs, and then go through the cycle again and repeat that cycle until it finally does reach physiological maturity. Now, most of these processes are sensitive to weather data, and most crop models do a pretty good job of capturing some of the main effects of weather on crop processes. Rainfall, of course, affects the soil, water, and soil nutrient balance. Yesterday, I reviewed some of these mechanisms. Phenology, growth, well, how quickly a crop passes through growth stages is controlled mostly by temperature, but also by day length. Photosynthesis is driven by solar radiation, but is also influenced by temperature, potential evapotranspiration, and crop water stress, which involves an interaction with the soil water balance. Respiration is also determined in the daytime by solar radiation and temperature, at night, primarily temperature. Temperature also plays a significant role in partitioning how much of the biomass goes to stems, leaves, grain, roots. A crop model's ability to capture the dynamic interactions between daily weather data, soil, water, and nitrogen balances, and crop growth and development actually makes them quite good in most cases at capturing the influence of weather and the interaction between weather and at least some of the management decisions that they can model. And this is these graphs of soybean yields in the state of Georgia in the United States from a set of variety trials versus climate information, climate data, kind of demonstrates this. Left panel is the relationship of yields between rainfall averaged over the season. On the middle, average daily maximum temperature versus yield. And then on the right, exactly the same data on a daily time step run through crop simulation model. The relationship is much stronger and much more linear. Farmers are not just interested in productivity, they're also interested in profitability. If either they have to pay for inputs in the market or if they sell some of their produce in the market. And so it's useful to have a tool to go from the productivity estimates that a crop model provides to profitability estimates. So an enterprise budget analysis is a simple analytical tool or process that describes sources and amounts of income, costs, and resulting profit associated with each management option. Sometimes I've heard the term in some countries in Africa of gross margin analysis. So the terminology might be different in different universities or different countries. It's likely that most agricultural students who've taken an introduction to farm management or an introduction to agricultural economics have been exposed to this. An enterprise budget makes some simplifications. First of all, the analysis is done on the smallest unit for which farmers make production management decisions. So when we talk about an enterprise, in this case, we're not talking about a farm, but the smallest activity within a farm that's managed for production and income. The farming system may contain many different enterprises. And results are also expressed on a unit land area basis or unit animal basis. This makes it possible to transfer, well, this makes the enterprise budget analysis relevant for a range of farmers in a given location. So what does an enterprise budget tell you? First of all, production cost. This tends to be the most complicated part of an enterprise budget analysis. Itemizing all the costs and figuring out what costs change as a function of changing management, which is very important if you're using an enterprise budget to compare the profitability of different management options. But this is important because many options for increasing productivity increase also the cost of production. So you might be able to, for example, to significantly increase your yield by adding more fertilizer, but that might reduce your income at high levels of fertilizer because of the added cost of more fertilizer. Gross receipts are the total income coming from that enterprise in a given year. So in the case of crops, it's yield times farm gate price. Or in the case of livestock, it's animal live weight times farm gate price. So that's quite simple. Gross margin is net income coming from the enterprise per unit land area or animal or profitability. And it's simply gross receipts, money coming in minus production costs, money going out. Once you've done these calculations, and we can also answer questions like what is the minimum price I need to receive when I sell my product in order to avoid a net loss for a given yield? Or what is the minimum yield do I need to avoid a net loss for a given farm gate price? For our purposes, we're particularly interested in gross margin, the profitability of an enterprise. And I just want to show a few graphs to illustrate how combining crop simulation model, enterprise budget analysis, and historical weather data can provide some useful insights. So this is an example based on an old publication focused on maize management in a location in Kenya. So this graph shows grain yield for several different management options for each year of available historical weather data up to the time that we did that study. And then a spreadsheet, a simple enterprise budget in a spreadsheet transformed those yields into gross margins. This is units of Kenyan, thousands of Kenyan shillings per hectare. So now if we've gone through this exercise, we have the information needed, for example, to calculate and graph mean productivity, the blue line, mean profitability, the orange line, and how they respond, for example, to fertilizer rate. So the top graph is a lower planting density, the bottom graph is a higher planting density. So it's then easy to find out what is the level of fertilizer that will maximize yields. Well, the higher planting density, yields kept on going up to 100 kilograms per hectare. But profitability, the orange line, gross margin, now shows a decrease in at higher fertilizer rates. And so with this information, we can identify the management option that maximizes expected profitability. But you recall that we said that average is not the only important consideration. The variability is also important. So we can also plug that same information into the kind of EV graph that we just looked at. So this is a plot of mean gross margin and standard deviation of gross margin for each of 10 different management strategies, 2 planting densities, low and high planting densities, and then 5 different fertilizer levels. So now we can again go through that same exercise we did before. I'm not going to take time to do so, but it would allow us in a more realistic scenario to ask what option maximizes expected profit? What option would a risk-neutral farmer select? What options might be considered by farmers with low, medium, high levels of risk aversion? Are there options here that no farmer would select because that farmer has several better options? It could be very tempting, and I have seen many cases where this is done. If a crop model combined with enterprise budget analysis makes it so easy to look in an objective way at many different management options and how weather information, climate information might influence those management options, why not combine these tools with some kind of a software platform to let the tool identify to generate management recommendations for farmers and tell the farmer what management option he or she should choose. This is done sometimes, but these tools do have very important limitations. Well, first of all, they require a lot of expertise, experience, data. The data may be hard to find. Collecting good quality data requires a lot of time and effort. It's very easy to misuse these tools if you don't understand them well. Often they overestimate smallholder farm yields, and the diagram on the right is meant to explain why. So if you look on the right, when crop models were developed, they were first developed to simulate potential yield by simulating photosynthesis, respiration, phenology, partitioning, driven by solar radiation and temperature and genetic characteristics. So if there are no constraints other than solar radiation or temperature, that would give you potential yield. Um, Soil water balance models, and then after that's nitrogen balance models, and in some cases, models for potassium, phosphorus have been added to the crop models. And this allows them also to come closer to on-farm yields because they can capture the effects of water limitations, soil nitrogen limitations. So the more processes the crop models consider, the closer they come to farmers' actual yields. However, there are many processes that crop models still cannot simulate that do impact and generally reduce on-farm yields. Examples are pests, diseases, micronutrient deficiencies, toxicities, other soil constraints. And this is why crop models often overestimate yields on smallholder farms. They require a lot of data, and in the case of soil, those data should be very local. Well, that's true also of weather data, but there has been progress in developing high resolution, high quality weather data in many African countries. So, but soil data is still a constraint, and soil properties can vary a great deal over small distances. And initial soil water content, soil nitrate content, organic carbon, that can also vary a lot from year to year. So unless these are measured on farm or at the field level, results could be misleading. And so for these reasons, model-based decision support tools should not be the only basis for making agricultural extension recommendations or for farmers to make decisions. So if they have these limitations, what could they be used for? Well, first of all, they can be quite useful for screening a range of management strategies and identify a promising subset that could be tested on farm or at the experiment station. So they're a useful tool for agricultural researchers to make their job easier and to focus their attention on promising options. They can also be used to test how sensitive particular recommended practices are to variability of climate or soil or price conditions, since a crop model allows you to vary these things quite easily if you have data from other locations or prices from different years. It allows a researcher or an agricultural advisor to kind of estimate how risky a particular management is in the face of climate variability. And all these things together make model-based tools a useful resource to help farmers and to advisors learn climate risk management principles, ask the right questions, discuss options together. So sometimes what we often refer to as decision support tools are sometimes called discussion support tools because they are appropriately used to guide discussions among farmers or between farmers and their advisors. Okay, I did cover a lot of material, but it looks like we're making good time. It is now time for a quiz. So let's put up the poll, and you'll have 5 minutes to go through this quiz.
Hello, dear participant. Hello. All the questions are in this board, so you just scroll down in the screen. You see in the right side there is a bar there. You scroll down so you can see the second question and the third. All the questions are there. Prof, we're already in 5 minutes. I see
It's now 5
220
minutes. Yeah.
participants respond, like we have 62%. They responded. Should we end it or we give them like 1-2 minutes? Yes, Prof.
See,
Should we end
how many responses do you have now?
238 out of
okay,
362. They have like 67%.
Okay.
Can give like 1 minute or 2 minutes? 2 minutes?
Maybe one more minute.
Okay. Yeah, participant, now you have 1 minute to complete the questions.
Okay, let's see how we did.
Yes, Prof. So you want me to end?
Yes, please.
Okay, now you can share screen.
Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. So question 1, which of the following statements about timescales is false? The statement that is false is B, weather forecasts are more important than seasonal forecasts for agricultural decision making because their timescale is more immediate. So how quickly a farmer needs information does not indicate how important that information is. Weather forecasts are important for short lead time tactical decisions, such as supplemental irrigation, when to harvest, when to plant. Seasonal climate forecasts at a longer lead time are important for many other decisions. So there's no basis for saying which is more important. But it is true that weather forecasts have a more immediate time scale, and so they must be accessed more accurately. So that statement is a false statement. Question 2, which of the following statements about risk aversion and farmer decision making is false? The statement that is false is C. Higher climate variability may lead a risk-neutral farmer to select a less profitable option. Higher climate variability may lead a risk-averse farmer to select a less profitable option, but not a risk-neutral farmer. A risk-neutral farmer cares just about maximizing expected returns and not about reducing their variability. Question 3, which of the following statements about tools and climate-sensitive agricultural decisions is false? The statement that is false is B. Crop simulation models can identify what management strategy is best for a particular farmer. I emphasized that crop models have limitations. They can be helpful, but they should not be the only basis for making recommendations or selecting a management option because of those limitations. So that is it for session 3. I will now load session 4. So session 4, the fourth topic that we're dealing with in the 6-part module is using climate information services for agriculture. You may recall that there are 4 pillars of climate services: generation, translation, transfer, and use. So here I'm going to go over a few examples of uses of climate services for agriculture and just illustrate some of the ways that it can benefit smallholder farmers and the agricultural sector more broadly. So at the end of this session, you should be able to describe how historical climate data can be used to adapt agricultural systems to local climate conditions, discuss opportunities and challenges to using seasonal climate forecasts for farm planning, explain key benefits and limitations of index-based agricultural insurance for smallholder farmers, and discuss the rationale and key features of food security anticipatory action. 4 different types of examples of how climate services are put into practice. So we'll talk first about historical climate information and how it can be used to better adapt agricultural systems to the historical climate. So adapting agriculture to climate change requires understanding the local climate. We cannot adapt to what we do not understand. Historical observations, records that are collected typically by meteorological stations on the ground, and then recorded and analyzed, are the primary source of knowledge about local climate in any given location. I mentioned on yesterday in the first session that climate is a statistics of weather. It includes things like seasonal cycles, information about variability, and if we're looking at impacts of that variability, it becomes risk, long-term trends that may be a result of anthropogenic climate change caused by human behavior. Although if you're looking at historical trends, you don't necessarily know the cause. And these are just a few graphs that I captured from the Zambia Meteorological Department's online tools, online map room tools. A number of countries across Africa are implementing similar types of tools based on gridded historical weather data that are available roughly every 4 to 5 kilometers across the country. So for agricultural researchers, historical data is useful for targeting production technologies to local conditions, to farmers' local conditions. So an agricultural research organization needs to consider climate conditions if they're developing production technologies that they intend to be adopted and that they intend to be profitable for farmers. So one example might be matching a breeding program or a seed distribution program, matching crop varieties with particular characteristics such as thermal time to maturity, water requirements, optimal temperature ranges to farmers' local growing season conditions, not just average, but also variability. And I was not able to find actual maps of that, but just to illustrate it, what this might look like. There's some analyses that I've found in the literature of the suitability of particular crops to local conditions. This is a screenshot of an Africa-wide map zoomed into Zambia, but also showing how we might compare maps of crop performance or crop suitability or variety recommended zones for varieties to maps that summarize climate conditions. And again, the maps on the right are from the Zambia Meteorological Department climate map rooms. The map on the left is from a slide presentation available online that was associated with a report by CIMMYT, the Maize and Wheat International Center for Maize and Wheat. For farmers, for researchers, for other agricultural decision makers, it's useful to look at historical climate to understand change. There are two possible errors when we're about perceptions of climate change, both of which can, instead of helping adapt to climate, they can lead to maladaptation, poorly adapted agricultural systems. So one mistake would be failing to recognize that climate conditions are changing. So, farmers often have traditional practices that historically were developed over time through trial and error to be very well adapted to local climate conditions. But if climate conditions have been changing, those traditional practices might no longer be well adapted to the new climate. Especially if farmers do not recognize that conditions are changing. But there's another problem. Farmers may perceive a change and assume or believe that it is a result of changing climate when something else is actually driving that change. So one example, I had conversations and looked at some publications by a collaborator, Roger Stern, and some others who in southern Zambia interacted with farmers. The farmers were very certain that climate was changing because they could observe more and more water stress in their crops. It was more and more difficult to grow rain-fed maize. It seemed like there were more and more years when the yields were reduced with visible signs of water stress. So it seems like they had a good argument that rainfall is decreasing and the risk of long dry spells is increasing. But then he worked with a group of farmers to look at the data and found no evidence the rainfall was decreasing at that location. And in that participatory exercise, concluded that it's actually land degradation, soil degradation, loss of organic matter in the soil over time, reducing water holding capacity. And that is what led to what they thought was climate change, decreasing rainfall. Skip the slide. So at the farm level, farmers are the ones who are ultimately responsible for choosing their own management. Agricultural researchers, agricultural extension officers do their best to provide guidance, but ultimately it's up to the farmer to decide what they will select, considering their goals, considering their constraints, considering risk tolerance, but they also consider traditional knowledge that's been accumulated over time. But traditional knowledge can fail if change occurs too rapidly. This could include changes in land use, changes in markets, changes in technology, but also changes in climate. So historical climate information allows farmers to better understand whether the climate is changing, how risky it is, how much variability there is in important aspects of climate. Are growing seasons starting later or earlier than they used to? Is total amount of rain changing? Or is rainfall becoming more intense, less frequent? There's a process that some of you might have heard of, PICSA, Participatory Integrated Climate Services for Agriculture, developed by University of Reading, and I'll mention it again tomorrow. It's kind of it's a structured participatory process designed to guide farmers to look at historical climate information, but also understand their decision options, their timing constraints, what resources available, and armed with that information, reconsider whether their farming and livelihood system is well adapted to their local climate. So each of the other examples I'm going to mention in this session also use historical data along with other types of climate information. So now we go to seasonal climate forecasts for farm planning. Seasonal climate forecasts, it seems to me that especially in Africa, what we now call climate services or climate information services have their roots in the development of seasonal forecasts. These are forecasts at lead times of 3 months or longer, typically. In 1997, I think late 1996, 97, in East, West, Southern Africa, regional climate outlook forums were organized to bring together national meteorological services to produce seasonal forecasts or seasonal outlooks. And then the national meteorological services were responsible for communicating and interpreting them within the countries. And that, to me, was an important milestone in the development of climate services. And it did have a very strong focus on agriculture. And the reason why is that there are a lot of really important agricultural decisions that have to be made before the start of the growing season that are sensitive, or early in the growing season, that are sensitive to climate conditions. So this new capability seemed to open up a lot of promise and generated a lot of interest for agriculture. So before the growing season at the farm level, farmers have to make decisions about how to allocate their farmland, household labor, scarce capital among different options. For crops, things like land preparation, selecting what crops, cultivars, planting density, initial fertilizer application, time of planting, all these need to be made before the start of the growing season, before the crop is planted. But also early in the growing season, there are decisions about things like fertilizer side dressing, weed management that may also benefit from seasonal climate forecasts. In the case of livestock, the timing may vary, and some of you who work in livestock may be able to actually help fill out this table in a more systematic and a better way. So things like herd stocking or destocking, buying animals, selling animals, herd migration, transhumance, in the case of pastoral systems, feed and forage management. So these are all decisions that you would find in the literature where farmers are surveyed to ask what decisions do they actually change in response to seasonal climate forecasts. There are some others, but these are seem to be among the most common decisions that farmers across Africa do report changing. One of the reasons why seasonal climate forecasts are useful is the interactions between climate management, management intensity, costs, productivity, profitability. So those are a lot of factors, and the interactions can be complex. The graphs on the right, they come from the same study that I showed. Well, they're based on simulations from the same study that I showed in the last session from Kenya, looking at maize management. And the top graph is yield, productivity. The bottom graph is gross margin, profitability, in thousands of Kenyan shillings per hectare. Again, like I showed in the last session, this is a nitrogen fertilizer response curve. But I separated it into the driest 1/3 of past years, the middle 1/3 of past years, and the wettest 1/3 of past years in terms of the October, November, December rainfall total. Just to show how yield and profitability interact with rainfall. So notice that whether you're looking at yield or looking at gross margin, the optimal fertilizer level is higher in wet years, much, much lower in dry years, and in years that are near normal in terms of the near normal rainfall tercile, somewhere in between. And this is generally true. If you can anticipate favorable climate conditions based on a seasonal forecast, then it is generally more profitable to increase the intensity of production. And that often means increasing investment in production inputs. And the converse of that, if you're anticipating unfavorable climate conditions, such as low rainfall, then it's more profitable to be less intensive in management. If we do that, if we use seasonal forecasts to adjust our management intensity, this is expected to improve farmer well-being on average over many years, but it does not guarantee that a farmer will be better off using the forecast in every single year. And this is an important thing for farmers to understand as they consider using seasonal forecasts, or for extension workers to understand as they consider making recommendations. And this graph, again from the same study, shows the gross margin for management that's optimized based on the forecast in green, or optimized on average in the red. So participants, please take a look at the webinar chat, because there's a request to fill out an attendance sheet. A lot of the early work on the early research on the use of seasonal forecasts by smallholder farmers in Africa put a lot of emphasis on challenges, problems, so much so that in the early 2000s, there seemed to be a growing sentiment that maybe we shouldn't even try to communicate seasonal forecasts to smallholder farmers, because the social scientists were emphasizing all of these problems. But the problems that they raised also suggested solutions. So the first, and I'll just go over a few of the key challenges and some of the potential solutions. So resource constraints. If we're talking about poor smallholder farmers, the factors that make life difficult make farming difficult for smallholder farmers in general, also affect their ability to act on seasonal climate forecasts. However, information has accumulated that shows that in most cases, sedentary farmers who grow crops at least as part of their farming systems, most sedentary farmers who access seasonal forecasts and other types of weather and climate information also do act on them. And this graph just shows an attempt that I made to, this is a few years old now, but the publications that I could find that reported access and use rates of seasonal forecasts, other information. I graphed here now the proportion, differentiating between crop-based farming, livestock, and mixed crop and livestock farming systems. Oh, let me go back. So there's the argument that they cannot use forecasts because they don't have the resources needed. And yet there's conflicting evidence to say that even though they cannot use forecasts, they actually do. So we need to look more broadly at what kinds of decisions they change. Well, even resource poor farmers who are not able to make a lot of the adjustments to their management that they would like to make based on the seasonal forecast, they may be able to change aspects of timing. They may be able to easily adjust allocation of resources, allocation of farmland between crops or varieties, allocation of household labor between different activities. But as an agricultural professional, a current or future agricultural professional, you might be in a position, if you discover particular resource constraints, to intervene. For example, if farmers, based on a seasonal forecast, realize that in some years they may find a high-yielding maize variety to be much more profitable instead of the drought-tolerant landrace that they currently use, if that new cultivar is not available in their location, then agricultural institutions may be able to help with availability. If there's a good argument why high-risk farmers may be facing a low-risk year in terms of climate conditions, they may work with lenders to make credit more available. There are potential solutions to the problems that resource poor farmers face when they're attempting to use climate information. And talking about the seasonal forecasts and management options might help reveal some of those constraints that institutions may help farmers solve. I don't see this or hear it as much now in the last 10 years as more than 10 years ago. But there has been a lot of concern in the past and in some literature that smallholder farmers cannot afford to use forecasts because the forecast might be wrong. This is actually not a problem with the forecast, but a problem with communication. So I've said and tried to emphasize that climate information, including seasonal forecasts, are inherently probabilistic. They are best expressed as probability distributions, although the probabilistic information is often expressed in slightly other manners. But it's always changes in probabilities, not a statement of what will happen in terms of the actual science and the actual generation of the forecast. But sometimes, by the time it reaches the farmer, it's miscommunicated with statements like rainfall will be above normal to normal, when maybe there's actually a 25 or 30% chance that it will be below normal. And here we're using above normal, near normal, and below normal as the wettest 1/3, middle 1/3, and driest 1/3 of past years. So the solution here is number one, be more careful about communicating the probabilistic nature of the forecasts. Avoid these deterministic statements. If farmers have seen a forecast sensationalized in the news media, try to correct that. But then some farmer training may also be important. So the third challenge is that the way forecasts have traditionally been communicated do not align well with farmer needs. So I mentioned about the regional climate outlook forums. Here is an example of a forecast product for Southern Africa coming out of the Sarkov Regional Climate Outlook Forum for the SADC region. If you look on the right, we have A, N, and B. So that's above normal, near normal, and below normal rainfall. These represent above normal is the wettest 1/3 of the past 30 years, near normal, the middle, and below normal is the drier 1/3 of past years for the January to March season. So since 1996, 1997, this has become the standard way of presenting forecasts regionally, and many national meteorological services adopted the same convention. And very quickly, it became immediately obvious that farmers at a particular location just do not find this useful. Some of the problems that emerge, well, one obvious problem is the coarse spatial scale. Looking at the map that I just showed you doesn't tell anything about rainfall at my particular farm's location. I used as the case of southern Zambia before. I'll imagine that I'm in southern province Zambia, a farmer. I see that map. How do I interpret it? It would take a lot of analyses, and as a farmer, I prefer not to have to do the analyses myself. I probably don't have access to the local historical climate data to be able to determine what below normal, near normal, above normal even mean. But using what we call terciles, 1/3 of the distribution, the wettest 1/3, the middle 1/3, the driest 1/3 of the historical probability distribution, implies that there are kind of two thresholds between those categories, the 33rd and approximately the 67th percentile of the historical distribution. Some farmer decisions might be sensitive to particular thresholds. A farmer might be interested to know, for example, how likely it is that they will have at least 400 millimeters of rainfall, because if it's less, it's quite likely that they will not have enough yield to cover their production costs. But that 400 millimeters of rainfall probably does not fall in the cutoff between those tercile categories that the meteorologists use. Those categories themselves can be very confusing, especially if they're not described well. They're often misunderstood because they're not defined. So what does normal rainfall? Normal rainfall does not mean what occurs most often. It doesn't mean good rainfall. It means the middle 1/3. So that can be misunderstood, but it's also really complicated for any decision maker to process a shift in probabilities compared to a shift from normal. So, for example, what does it mean if there's predicted to be above normal probability of experiencing below normal rainfall? And one psychological study that I've seen on this showed that these sorts of statements cause widespread, serious misinterpretations. And the subjective methods that were used also often miss important characteristics that are more important than total seasonal rainfall or average temperature conditions for management, things like timing, spells, extreme events, and how they impact crops, livestock, forage conditions. Fortunately, advances in climate science, climate prediction, but also new formats for presenting climate information are starting to address these problems. So lack of information about local climate can be solved by downscaling the format to a local scale based on historical climate records at or near the farmer's location, but also presenting the forecast with information about the local climate variability. Confusing categories, the trouble processing them, the fact that the categories suggest thresholds that are not relevant to decision makers. Well, if the farmer is given the forecast as an entire probability distribution compared to the probability distribution of historical variability, that can overcome those problems about categories. And the objective methods that are increasingly used, replacing subjective consensus methods, make it possible then to forecast additional variables like the start of the rainy season, the length of the growing season, risk of dry spells during particular critical periods. However, communicating this information with farmers also requires an investment in training. So I mentioned here the flexible forecast. And all of these solutions, they are implemented in a product that a number of national meteorological services in Africa are starting to implement, not necessarily replacing their conventional method, but as an alternative. So at a particular location, it shows the historical probability distribution as a probability of exceedance curve. The y-axis is the probability of getting greater than or equal to this much rainfall. And the red curve shows what the forecast distribution is. This is difficult to use without training, but we have experience training farmers, even smallholder farmers, to be able to understand and act on this type of forecast. The final challenge comes because the types of decisions that farmers make prior to the start of the rainy season may be very sensitive to differences among farmers, different goals and constraints, different levels of risk aversion, small differences in the local climate. This is not a problem in itself, but for an agricultural extension service, if they are attempting to disseminate a recommendation about what farmers should do, those recommendations may be problematic if they're too top-down, if they don't consider these individual farmer differences. So the potential solutions, well, first of all, be cautious about top-down recommendations to farmers based on seasonal forecasts. If they involve farm-level resource allocation decisions, be aware that those decisions may be very sensitive to individual farmer characteristics, and blanket recommendations may just not be valid or useful. As an alternative, consider participatory communication and training approaches that build farmers' own capacity to understand the forecast information and make decisions that are consistent with their own goals and resource constraints. The final use of climate services that I want, this is not the final. The third use that I want to highlight is insurance, but not any insurance, index-based agricultural insurance, often just called index insurance. I don't know how many of you have encountered index-based insurance before. It's becoming more and more widespread, so I'm suspecting many of you have heard of it and may already be familiar. And this will be a fairly superficial introduction. Any insurance is designed to protect a policyholder from a specific risk by providing a monetary payout when a covered loss occurs. This is a very formalized contract-based arrangement between a policyholder, a client, and an insurance provider. This is also true in agriculture. So the thing that makes insurance sometimes worthwhile is that by making a small payout in all years, you can receive protection that may be needed in a particularly bad year. In the case of agriculture, insurance has two different roles. There's a protection role, but there's also a promotion role. So insurance sometimes protects the farmer's productive assets from extreme events. We can think of insurance for livestock, preventing loss or compensating for loss of animals. But it also can promote farmers' livelihoods by overcoming risk as a constraint to improve production practices or improved access to credit. So to understand index-based insurance, the best way to do that is compare it with traditional insurance. It's also called indemnity insurance or loss-based. It compensates for a particular loss. The payout is based on a loss that is verified. So with traditional insurance and most forms of insurance, not just in agriculture, if a policyholder experiences a loss, then they will submit a claim. The insurance company will usually send a person called a claims adjuster to the farm to verify that the loss actually occurred. And as you can imagine, if you have the case of hundreds of thousands or millions of smallholder farmers, very small land holdings, therefore very small insurance policies, remote areas that are hard to access, for an insurance company to have to send that insurance adjuster to every one of those locations, it's just not possible. So traditional insurance was simply not ever considered feasible for smallholder farmers. Now, starting around, I want to say mid-2000s, around 2005, World Bank and some other organizations started to experiment with index-based insurance. In this case, the payout is not based on an actual loss. It's based on some kind of an index that is correlated with farmers' loss. And index-based insurance has overcome some of the major barriers to insuring smallholder farmers. So, well, there are three main types of index-based agricultural insurance. In this introduction to climate information services, we're kind of focused on the first type, weather index insurance, where the index is based on meteorological data or data that are related to climate. The most common is rainfall data. Sometimes that rainfall data is run through a soil water balance. And temperature is sometimes used. Flood inundation, remote sensing is also used in the case of excess rainfall leading to flood damage. Second category is area yield insurance. In this case, yields are estimated over a large area, possibly using government production statistics. More often, the insurance company will have somebody go and do statistical sampling across a number of farms over a large area. And then it's the average yield over a large area, not an individual farmer's yields, that would be the basis for determining whether a farmer is eligible for a payout. In the case of livestock, index-based livestock insurance is sometimes based on animal mortality data over a defined area. Where this is implemented, it's similar to area yield insurance. So one case that I know about that is Mongolia in Central Asia, where severe freezes, extreme cold can cause loss of herd mortality. In Africa, the index-based livestock insurance that I'm aware of is based on remote sensing of vegetation as a proxy for grazing resources and the carrying capacity of rangelands. As with any new concept, there is some jargon to learn. So I'm showing on the right an example of a typical rainfall insurance, index insurance contract. And on the left, some terms. So a premium is the amount of money that a farmer would have to pay every year, usually quite a while before the start of the growing season, in order to have coverage for that year. If the farmer if the index goes below a threshold, the farmer will be eligible to receive payment from the insurance company. So the premium is money that the farmer gives to the insurance company. The payout is money that the insurance company gives in particular years, not every year, back to the farmer to cover an expected loss. The contract window is the period of time when the index is valid. And often an index insurance contract for crops will try to cover the periods when the crop will be most sensitive to a weather or climate stress. Sometimes, for example, it would be around germination early in the growing season, and again around flowering to the end of seed set. Two periods where the crops might be particularly sensitive to insufficient rainfall. So looking at the graph on the left, the x-axis is rainfall during the contract window. If rainfall is above this trigger, there's no payout. If rainfall goes below that trigger, then farmers will receive a payout. But the amount of the payout depends on how low it goes. So many insurance contracts have this linear increase in the payout amount from a trigger to what we call an exit. If the rainfall index goes below this exit, then farmers get 100% of the payout, the maximum payout. Index-based insurance has several advantages that have made it possible to provide insurance coverage for smallholder farmers who have just not been able to access traditional insurance. Some of the advantages of index-based insurance, because the payout is based on an index that's easily measured, no farm visit is required. So that results in a quicker payout. Sometimes with e-banking, the payout, farmers can receive money from a payout in a matter of days to a couple of weeks after the index falls below the trigger. This also reduces operating costs, and some of the reduction in operating costs gets passed on to the farmer. So the cost of index-based insurance, the premiums tend to be much lower than with traditional insurance because the cost to the insurance company is lower. So these changes in particular have made it possible, as I mentioned, for smallholder farmers to access insurance. Index insurance also does not create a disincentive to good manager or an incentive to neglect their crops. But traditional insurance perhaps does. If a farmer is struggling with, for example, weather or climate conditions, they may have a perverse incentive or feel that they have a perverse incentive to neglect their crop, exaggerate how bad the stress was, that led to a crop failure, allow the crop to fail so that they can receive a payout instead of working hard, putting in extra effort to try to protect the crop. If the farmer's payout is based on an index that is not related to their actual on-farm yields, they may get the payout but still get some income from the crop if they manage it well. The chief limitation of index-based insurance, the chief weakness, is what is called basis risk. The basis of the payout is not a farmer's actual loss, but an index that's correlated with loss. But that correlation is not perfect. It means that a farmer might pay for insurance, experience a serious loss, but because the index doesn't go past the trigger, that farmer might not be eligible for a payout when the farmer needs it. And so this key limitation requires very careful communication, education with the farmers. Basis risk, the possibility that they might experience a loss but not be covered and not receive a payout, needs to be communicated very carefully. If we were sitting together, this would be a good time to ask you, do you think that all farmers should have insurance? Why or why not? And after we will have discussed that, I would point out that insurance can be a very effective way to reduce some types of risk, particularly extreme events that farmers cannot handle in other ways. But insurance is also a very expensive way to reduce risk. When averaged over many, many years, if insurance does not subsidize the payout, the farmers will give more money to the insurance company in the form of premiums than they receive back in the form of payouts after a covered event. So if this is the case, if on average farmers have less income with insurance than they do without it, then what's the reason for insurance? Well, we can think of a few circumstances that may make it worth the cost. So one of the most important question is, does having insurance change the way a farmer farms? Does insurance open up opportunities to increase average farm income more than the added cost? And in many cases, the answer is yes. If the farmer does not adopt the best production technologies because the farmer perceives a risk, if the farmer is not able to access credit or production inputs because the lender or the input supplier is risk averse, having insurance coverage may overcome risk as a barrier to improve farming practices. So this is one of the most important questions to ask. What will farmers do something differently as a result of having insurance? If the answer is yes, it might be worthwhile. But there are also questions about, can the design of the insurance make it more cost effective? And in some cases, yes. Well, just switching from traditional insurance to index-based insurance in general has decreased the cost of insurance. But the cost per farmer will also decrease as more and more farmers adopt. If some of the cost, not of the premium, but other costs to the insurance company, data, for example, needed to generate the index and evaluate the index, insurance literacy awareness for farming communities. If public organizations subsidize those costs instead of the insurance company bearing those costs, that can help reduce the cost without sacrificing the benefit. And other farmers, if they have options for the type of insurance coverage, some of the decisions that they make may influence the costs. So in general, it's best to insure only high impact risks that farmers cannot manage in other ways. If farmers want big payouts, if they want more frequent payouts, they need to realize that that will increase the cost to them and it might not be cost effective. So how frequent should the payout be and what should the maximum payout be? Those are crucial design questions that are best made with farmers' participation, with farmers also understanding the implications of those decisions on the cost that they will bear. So climate services, in the case of area yield index or livestock mortality index, climate information may not enter at all. In the case of weather index insurance, climate services play a crucial but a limited role. In a lot of cases, most cases that I'm aware of in Africa, the insurance company either uses their own proprietary station networks or proxy weather data based on remote sensing. If they set up their own station networks, that increases the cost. They may not be able to go back enough years to, they can monitor the index, but they can't really design it well because they don't have the historical information. Satellite remote sensing data have good spatial coverage, but very poor quality. So insurance companies seem to be reluctant to collaborate with public sector national meteorological services or agricultural research institutions. I've tried to get a better understanding of why, and I don't think that the reasons are completely valid. We would expect, in principle, we would expect that stronger collaboration between insurance providers and national meteorological services and national agricultural research services would improve the quality of index insurance and reduce basis risk. The final use that I want to highlight of climate services for agriculture is now on the humanitarian community side, food security, early warning, and early action in particular. So the goal of food security humanitarian interventions are to save lives and save livelihoods when, number one, a crisis exceeds a community's capacity to cope, and number two, when the crisis may have long-term impacts on livelihoods or health. So yesterday in session 2, we talked about coping strategies and some of the factors that can cause a climate-driven food crisis, a food production shortfall, to have long-term impacts on lives or livelihoods. Food security and other humanitarian organizations understand this well, and this has been a concern for a long time. So traditionally, humanitarian organizations implemented various early warning systems, characterizing risk, monitoring signs of food insecurity. If either a harvest assessment around the time of harvest or other evidence of food insecurity, increasing prices in the markets, indicated that there was a problem, the previous method that was in place and is still implemented sometimes triggers a needs assessment on the ground, then an emergency appeal to various funders, an attempt to mobilize, first of all, financial resources, and then in some cases procure food, either get money that can be transferred to the affected communities or food aid. And then finally, when all these things have lined up, there's on the ground intervention in the form of food aid or emergency feeding programs or cash transfers or vouchers, whatever it is. A collaborator, Mengestab Haile, he did a presentation in a paper that documented, in the case of Ethiopia in the early 2000s, how long this process typically took. So from the time that a humanitarian organization recognized a problem before they could actually do anything on the ground was typically about 6 months. And by that point, communities have already run out of food, they're suffering, and the degree of suffering determines whether the impact may have long-term health or livelihood impacts. So this awareness, well, there's an awareness that this kind of delay is costly. As I mentioned, it increases the likelihood of long-term impacts on the affected community. It's costly for the community, but it's also costly for the humanitarian organization. Once they have the resources, it becomes a widespread emergency. And so the cost of procuring food, the cost of transporting it, the logistical cost at that point, because it has to be done in a rush, can be extremely high. So this triggered this awareness, plus a few high-profile food crises in the early 2000s, especially in the Greater Horn of Africa, and some experience that our institution was involved in with the Red Cross in West Africa, triggered a movement among humanitarian food security organizations to increase the timeliness of interventions through early warning, early action systems, anticipatory action. So features of an early action initiative typically include some kind of an early warning system, and this is where climate services often enter. Thresholds of early warning indicators that would trigger action. So if the indicator is monitoring, then it's called an early action initiative. If it's actually a forecast of future conditions, then it's called anticipatory action, which can increase the lead time even further. These initiatives also have predefined contingency plans. So once the money's made, the decisions about, once the money becomes available, once the trigger has been, once the early warning indicator has been triggered, the actions have been predefined, the interventions have been predefined. So there's not a lot of time wasted debating about what should you do. But it also needs rapid finance, either through emergency contingency funds or insurance. There are insurance policies that a government instead of a farmer can hold. So when a threshold is triggered, contingency plans are activated, funding is released quickly. So this allows intervention to occur much earlier. Benefits in general are reduced cost of humanitarian action, reduced cost to the humanitarian organization, which in turn means more scarce resources are available to actually benefit the communities who are affected. Reduced food insecurity in the short term, reduced loss of long-term livelihood potential in the longer term. So climate information services may or may not play a major part in food security, early action, or anticipatory action, but climate services primarily enter as part of the early warning systems. These early warning systems often consider both monitored and forecast climate information. If they're concerned, for example, about floods, a lot of the activities, for example, of Red Cross are interested in weather forecasts out to a few days and the risk of floods. They may release resources to help prepare for the flood instead of just responding afterward. Some organizations, for example, World Food Program is involved in this kind of initiative with drought, slow onset shock. So they're interested in seasonal forecasts of rainfall. These food security early warning systems are sometimes involve the National Meteorological Services, but sometimes they're independently. When they don't involve the National Meteorological Service, you have to ask, and sometimes they fail to ask, are they using the best available climate information, the highest quality climate information? Are they taking advantage of the knowledge that's available within the country? Quiz time, we're more or less on schedule, so we're going to go ahead and take 5 minutes to do the quiz on this session. Could you put up the poll and I will start my timer?
Yes, Prof, it is online. Dear Prof, 5 minutes done. We have 154,568 out of 331. We are in 50% response.
Okay, yeah. So in the interest
So
in the interest of
we
time,
end the quiz.
Oh. yes. So in the
People are
interest
still
of
answering.
time, we'll go ahead
Okay.
and review because it's time to end our session. I don't want to hold people over time.
You can share your slide.
Okay, let's review our answers. Question 1, which of the following statements is not an example of how historical climate data can benefit agriculture? The statement that is not an example is agricultural researcher extrapolating trends in historical data to project what the local climate will be like 30 years from now. That is not a poor way. That is a poor way to estimate climate change. Climate change is not an extrapolation of past trends. This also should not be something that agricultural researchers should do. So it's likely that this kind of analysis will give very misleading information. All of the other statements are good examples of how historical climate data may benefit agriculture. Number 2, which of the following statements is not an example of good practice for supporting farmers' use of seasonal forecasts? The statement that is not a good example is C, providing expert advice about allocation of farm land and labor based on the seasonal forecast. I emphasize that those decisions are very sensitive to individual farmer circumstances. The other examples are good examples of good practice for supporting farmers' use of seasonal forecasts. 3, which of the following statements about the relative advantages of index-based versus traditional agriculture insurance is false? The statement that is false is A, more accurate estimation of farmers' losses is an advantage of index-based insurance. Basis risk is a disadvantage of index insurance, and basis risk means that there's actually a less accurate estimation of farmers' actual losses in the case of index insurance compared to indemnity insurance. 4, which of the following is not a feature of food security anticipatory action? Appeal for relief funds is part of the traditional mechanism that led to long delays. So anticipatory action or early action initiatives always have some kind of rapid finance that doesn't require an appeal. The funds are released as soon as the early warning trigger passes the threshold. It is time to finish. There are a number of thoughtful questions, some too detailed, way beyond the scope of what the session is, what this module is meant to cover, and some beyond my expertise. There are questions about the difference between a weather and a seasonal forecast. A seasonal forecast is a forecast with a lead time of several months. It has a different basis than weather forecasts, which go out to maybe a week to 10 days. Seasonal forecasts are inherently probabilistic. There are actually quite a few questions about index insurance, which suggests that there's possibly interest, demand for additional resources that go beyond what this module intends to cover on index insurance. It is time to finish. I want to thank you again for your attention and apologize that I haven't been able to respond to all the comments and questions. So the final 2 sessions will be tomorrow at the same time, covering communication challenges around climate information services for farmers, for rural communities, and then how the concept of climate justice enters into climate information services. So I look forward to talking with you tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Some housekeeping.
Okay, so we are, the presentation is now finished. I see that participants are starting to exit. So we'll talk to you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Florence, want to say something?
It's okay, Nada. Please thank you participants for coming, and let's close the session.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, dear. Okay, bye all.